July 24th, 1943. Hamburg, Germany's second largest city, home to over 1 million people. The Nazi radar screens suddenly explode with thousands of aircraft signatures. Panic erupts. Air raid sirens wail across the city. But here's the twist. Most of those planes don't exist. They're ghosts, phantoms created by tons of aluminum foil dropped from actual bombers. This seemingly absurd idea would become one of World War II's most devastating tactical innovations, codenamed Operation Gomorrah. Discover how British scientists turned Hitler's most advanced defense system into his greatest liability, using nothing more than strips of metal foil that cost pennies to produce. This is the story of Window and how it changed aerial warfare forever. By early 1943, Nazi Germany had constructed the most sophisticated air defense network the world had ever seen. The Kammhuber Line, named after General Joseph Kammhuber, stretched from Denmark to the Swiss border, creating an invisible fortress in the sky. At its heart was radar technology that the Germans believed gave them an unbeatable advantage. The system relied primarily on two types of radar installations. The Freya early warning radar could detect incoming bomber formations at ranges exceeding 120 kilometers. Once detected, the information passed to Würzburg tracking radars, which could pinpoint individual aircraft with remarkable accuracy. These stations worked in concert with searchlight batteries and anti-aircraft guns, creating overlapping zones of detection and destruction. German night fighters, primarily Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Junkers Ju-88s, used this network to devastating effect. The fighters carried their own airborne radar sets, the Liechtenstein system, which allowed them to close in for the kill once ground controllers vectored them toward bomber streams. By the spring of 1943, RAF Bomber Command was losing aircraft at an unsustainable rate. On some raids, losses exceeded 10% of the attacking force. The statistics painted a grim picture. Between March and July 1943, Bomber Command lost over 1,000 aircraft. At this rate, aircrew had less than a 30% chance of surviving a full tour of 30 operations. Something had to change, or the strategic bombing campaign would collapse under the weight of its own casualties. British scientific intelligence, led by figures like Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, worked frantically to understand German radar capabilities. Through captured equipment, interrogation of prisoners, and signals intelligence, they pieced together how the system functioned. The Germans had built their entire defensive strategy around radar superiority. This strength, Jones realized, could become a catastrophic weakness if the radar could be fooled. The answer came from an unlikely source: basic physics. Radar works by transmitting radio waves that bounce off objects and return to a receiver. The size of the reflection depends on the object's size and composition. Metal reflects radio waves exceptionally well. If you could create thousands of false radar returns, you could overwhelm the operators and render the system useless. Dr. Joan Curran, a brilliant Welsh physicist working at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, proposed a deceptively simple solution. Strips of aluminum foil, cut to half the wavelength of German radar frequencies, would create radar reflections similar to actual aircraft. Drop enough of these strips and you could saturate radar screens with false contacts. The Germans wouldn't be able to distinguish real bombers from ghosts. The concept wasn't entirely new. British researchers had discovered this principle in 1937, but had kept it classified, fearing the Germans might use it against British radar defenses. By 1942, evidence suggested the Germans hadn't discovered the technique, or at least weren't using it. The weapon had a name: Window. Each bundle consisted of strips measuring 27 centimeters long and 2 centimeters wide, meticulously cut to match German radar frequencies. Testing proved the concept devastatingly effective. A handful of window bundles created radar signatures equivalent to a heavy bomber. The material was cheap, lightweight, and could be carried in vast quantities. But deploying it required a difficult decision. Once used, the Germans would certainly copy it and use it against British defences. Winston Churchill himself would have to authorize its operational use, weighing the immediate tactical advantage against the long-term strategic risk. Throughout late 1942 and early 1943, window remained one of Britain's most closely guarded secrets. The technology sat ready, tested and proven, yet unused because of fears about German retaliation. The debate raged at the highest levels of British military and political leadership. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, pushed aggressively for Window's deployment. He understood that his crews were dying at unsustainable rates. And here was a weapon that could save hundreds of lives. The opposition came primarily from Air Defence of Great Britain, the organization responsible for protecting British cities from Luftwaffe attacks. They argued that once Window was revealed, German bombers would use it to penetrate British radar defences. Fighter Command would be blinded, leaving cities vulnerable to devastating night raids, similar to the Blitz of 1940 and 1941. Dr. Jones and his team at Scientific Intelligence provided crucial analysis. They examined Luftwaffe capabilities and determined that by mid-1943, Germany simply lacked the bomber strength to mount a sustained offensive against Britain, even with window countermeasures. The vast majority of German aircraft were committed to the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, or defending German airspace against Allied raids. The Luftwaffe no longer posed the existential threat it once had. Meanwhile, the intelligence picture grew more worrying. Signals intercepts suggested that German scientists were working on their own chaff countermeasures, which they called Düppel. If the Germans deployed it first, they would gain both offensive and defensive advantages. The window of opportunity for British surprise was closing. In June 1943, Harris presented his case to the Defense Committee. The statistics were undeniable. The Battle of the Ruhr, conducted between March and July 1943, had cost Bomber Command 872 aircraft destroyed and 2,126 damaged. Approximately 4,200 aircrews had been killed or captured. These losses occurred during just 18 major operations. At this rate, Bomber Command would exhaust its trained crews before achieving strategic objectives. Harris proposed Hamburg as the target for Window's combat debut. Germany's second city was a vital industrial center, home to shipyards, U-boat construction facilities, and major port infrastructure. The city's location on the Elbe River, relatively close to British bases, made it an ideal target for sustained operations. Most importantly, Hamburg was heavily defended by radar-guided flak and night fighters. It would provide the ultimate test of Window's effectiveness. Churchill convened a meeting of the War Cabinet on July 15, 1943. The Prime Minister had reservations, but the military arguments proved compelling. Fighter Command had developed new tactics and technologies to counter chaff, including improved radar frequencies and ground-controlled interception methods. These wouldn't make British defences immune to window, but they would mitigate the damage. The same couldn't be said for German defences, which would be caught completely unprepared. After intense debate, Churchill made his decision. Operation Gomorrah would proceed, with window deployed for the first time during the opening raid. The operation would consist of multiple raids over 10 days, maintaining pressure on Hamburg's defences and emergency services. The objective wasn't just to damage industrial targets, but to create a firestorm that would devastate the city and demonstrate the consequences of continued German resistance. The authorization came with a grim acknowledgement. Window would save British lives in the short term, but would ultimately spread to all combatants. Like poison gas in World War I, radar countermeasures would become a standard feature of aerial warfare. The age of radar supremacy was about to end, replaced by an ongoing technological arms race between detection and deception. With Churchill's approval secured, Bomber Command moved rapidly to prepare Operation Gomorrah. The logistics were staggering. Window had to be manufactured in enormous quantities, distributed to bomber stations across England, and loaded aboard aircraft alongside standard ordnance. Crews needed training on deployment procedures without compromising operational security. British industry ramped up window production immediately. The strips were made from aluminum foil, which was in short supply due to aircraft manufacturing demands. Engineers developed efficient cutting machines that could produce thousands of bundles daily. Each bundle weighed approximately half a kilogram and contained roughly 2,000 individual strips. A typical heavy bomber like the Lancaster would carry approximately 2,000 bundles, requiring constant ejection throughout the raid to maintain a radar-obscuring cloud. Bomber Command selected 791 aircraft for the opening strike. Scheduled for the night of July 24th, 25th, 1943, the force included 347 Avro Lancasters, 246 Handley Page Halifaxes, 195 Short Stirlings, and 73 Vickers Wellingtons. This represented one of the largest bombing forces yet assembled for a single target. Each aircraft was loaded with a mixture of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries, designed to shatter buildings and ignite the debris. Air Marshal Harris personally briefed squadron commanders on Windows deployment. The material would be pushed through the aircraft's flare chute at 1-minute intervals, beginning 15 minutes before reaching Hamburg's coast. Specific crew members, typically the navigator or bomb aimer, would be responsible for maintaining the rhythm. Consistency was crucial. If window deployment ceased, that aircraft would suddenly appear clearly on German radar screens, marking it for destruction. German defenses around Hamburg were formidable. The city was protected by 54 heavy flak batteries with 256 guns, ranging from 80 mm to 128 mm caliber. An additional 26 light flak batteries provided coverage against low-altitude attackers. 3 night fighter airfields operated within interception range, with approximately 100 fighters available for deployment. The Himmelbett system, an elaborate network of radar-controlled interception boxes, formed overlapping zones of coverage. British planners studied weather patterns intensively. Hamburg in late July typically experienced warm, dry conditions. If the raid succeeded in starting widespread fires, the heat might create a self-sustaining firestorm, drawing in oxygen from surrounding areas and generating hurricane-force winds. This phenomenon had occurred accidentally during some previous raids, but had never been deliberately planned at this scale. The aircrew briefings emphasized the experimental nature of Window. Intelligence officers explained that radar operators would see their screens fill with thousands of contacts, making it impossible to track individual aircraft. However, the briefings also warned that the effect was theoretical. No one knew exactly how German operators would react, or whether backup systems might compensate for the jamming. Security surrounding Operation Gomorrah was extraordinary. Ground crews loading window bundles onto aircraft were told they were loading anti-submarine detection devices. Only aircrew who would actually deploy the material knew its true purpose, and they received briefings on the day of the mission. British intelligence monitored German communications channels, listening for any indication that the secret had been compromised. On July 24, 1943, weather reconnaissance confirmed favorable conditions. Afternoon briefings commenced across dozens of airfields in eastern England. Crews gathered in operations rooms to learn their target and routes. When Hamburg appeared on the maps, few were surprised. The city had been raided multiple times before, but when Window was revealed, the atmosphere changed. This raid would be different. This raid might change everything. As darkness fell across England, over 700 heavy bombers prepared for takeoff, each carrying a secret weapon that weighed almost nothing but might. Decide the war's outcome, the first bombers departed British airfields at approximately 100 hours on July 24, 1943. They formed up over the North Sea in a bomber stream stretching over 200 kilometers. a river of aircraft flowing eastward toward Germany. Navigator tables were stacked with window bundles, taking up space normally reserved for equipment and personal items. At the designated point, 15 minutes from the German coast, crews began pushing bundles down the flare chutes. The aluminum strips tumbled through the night sky, separating and spreading as they fell. Each bundle created a radar signature equivalent to a bomber for several minutes, before dispersing too widely to reflect effectively, with bundles being deployed every minute from hundreds of aircraft. The cumulative effect was catastrophic for German radar operators. At Stade radar station, approximately 60 kilometers northwest of Hamburg, the first indications appeared at 2356 hours. Freyer operator Unteroffizier Hartmann watched his scope in confusion as the screen suddenly filled with contacts. The normal, neat procession of discrete blips transformed into a solid mass of returns. He called his supervisor immediately, suspecting equipment malfunction. Across the Kammhuber Line, similar scenes unfolded. Würzburg operators attempting to provide precision tracking for night fighters found their scopes completely saturated. The tracking system relied on identifying individual aircraft and vectoring fighters toward them. Now, instead of tracking one bomber, each radar set showed dozens or hundreds of equally strong returns. The system simply collapsed under information overload. German fighter controller Hauptmann Helmut Lent, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced night fighter directors, attempted to coordinate defenses from his command post. His carefully structured system of interception boxes had become useless. Pilots reported that their airborne Liechtenstein radars showed the same bewildering mass of contacts. They couldn't distinguish real bombers from whatever was creating these phantom returns. Some night fighter pilots, operating on visual sighting and instinct, managed to find bomber streams and engage. Oberleutnant Werner Barker, flying a Bf-110, visually acquired a Halifax silhouetted against searchlights and shot it down over the Elbe estuary. But these successes were isolated. The systematic, radar-directed slaughter that German night fighters normally inflicted had become impossible. Anti-aircraft batteries fared no better. Radar-predicted flak relied on Würzburg sets to provide accurate altitude and position data for calculating firing solutions. With the radar sets showing only a confused mass of targets, gun crews reverted to barrage fire, throwing shells into the bomber stream based on sound and searchlight estimates. This was far less effective than radar-directed fire, wasting ammunition and creating minimal danger for bombers maintaining proper altitude. The bomber stream reached Hamburg shortly after midnight. Pathfinder aircraft, equipped with specialized navigation aids, marked the target area with colored flares and incendiaries. The main force followed, dropping 2,896 tons of bombs across the city's northern districts. The mix of high explosives and incendiaries was carefully calculated to maximize destruction. High explosive bombs would shatter buildings and rupture water mains, while incendiaries would ignite the debris. German civil defense personnel watched in horror as fires erupted across multiple districts simultaneously. The normal procedure involved concentrating fire brigades on the worst-hit areas, containing blazes before they spread. But with hundreds of fires igniting at once, resources were immediately overwhelmed. Hamburg's fire services, considered among Europe's best, found themselves unable to respond effectively to the simultaneous emergencies. By 0300 hours on July 25th, the last bombers were crossing back over the North Sea toward England. Aircrew debriefings revealed the dramatic effectiveness of Window. Crews reported minimal night fighter activity and reduced flak accuracy. Initial estimates suggested losses would be remarkably light compared to previous Hamburg raids. As dawn broke over England on July 25th, the true scale of Window's success became apparent. Of the 791 aircraft dispatched, only 12 failed to return, a loss rate of just 1.5%. This was extraordinary. Previous raids on heavily defended targets like Hamburg typically suffered losses of 4 to 6%, sometimes higher. Window had effectively cut losses to a quarter of normal rates. The human dimension of this statistic was profound. Approximately 80 air crews had been spared death or captivity because German radar defenses had been blinded. Over the course of Operation Gomorrah's planned multiple raids, this protection would save hundreds of lives. Air Marshal Harris's gamble had paid immediate dividends. In Hamburg, morning revealed the extent of the night's devastation. The raid had killed approximately 1,500 people and rendered 24,000 homeless. Entire blocks of apartment buildings had been reduced to smoking rubble. But this was only the beginning. Harris had no intention of allowing Hamburg to recover. The strategic concept behind Gomorrah involved repeated attacks over several days, preventing effective firefighting and rescue operations, and maintaining pressure on civil defense services. German military leadership reacted with shock and confusion to Window's deployment. General Oberst Josef Kammhuber, architect of Germany's air defense network, immediately recognized that his entire system had been rendered obsolete overnight. He ordered urgent investigation into the nature of the countermeasure and demanded solutions from German scientists and engineers. Captured window bundles reached German laboratories within hours. Scientists identified the strips as simple aluminum foil cut to specific wavelengths. The simplicity was almost insulting. This was not some advanced technology requiring industrial facilities or rare materials. It was something any nation with aluminum and scissors could produce. German researchers had independently discovered this principle years earlier and called it Düppel, but had never deployed it for the same reasons that had paralyzed British decision-making: fear of enemy retaliation. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, flew into a rage when briefed on the situation. He had repeatedly assured Hitler that German airspace was secure, that radar technology provided an impenetrable shield. Now that shield had been shattered by strips of foil. Göring demanded immediate countermeasures and scapegoats. Several radar officers were relieved of command, despite bearing no responsibility for the technological surprise. German engineers worked frantically to develop solutions. The most immediate fix involved trying to distinguish real bombers from window clouds by observing which radar returns moved in consistent patterns. Window strips fluttered chaotically as they fell, creating relatively stationary or erratically moving contacts. Real bombers followed predictable courses. This technique, called manual tracking, required skilled operators and was far less effective than the automated systems Window had defeated. Another approach involved developing new radar frequencies. Window was cut to specific wavelengths, matching known German radar frequencies. If Germany switched to different frequencies, the strips would become less effective. However, this required manufacturing and deploying entirely new radar equipment across the defensive network, a process that would take months or years, not days. British intelligence monitored German reactions through ultra-intercepts of Enigma-encrypted communications. The decrypt revealed the depth of German confusion and the absence of immediate countermeasures. This intelligence confirmed that Bomber Command could continue exploiting Window's advantages for the foreseeable future. Harris ordered intensified operations against German cities, knowing his crews now possessed a protective advantage that significantly improved their survival odds. Hamburg, however, would bear the brunt of this revelation. The city's ordeal was far from over. Bomber Command returned to Hamburg on the night of July 27-28, 1943, for the operation's second major raid. Once again, Window saturated German radar screens, preventing effective interception. But this raid would produce something far worse than the first attack. Hamburg was about to experience one of history's most devastating firestorms. The weather conditions were perfect for catastrophe. Hamburg had experienced several weeks of unusual heat and drought. Buildings damaged in the first raid remained unrepaired. their shattered windows and damaged roofs creating ideal conditions for fire spread. The city's working-class eastern districts featured dense concentrations of older buildings, with timber construction and closely spaced structures. At approximately 57 hours on July 28th, the first markers went down over Hamburg's Hammerbrook and Rothenburg-Sort districts. These densely populated areas housed workers from Hamburg's port and industrial facilities. The neighborhood's narrow streets and closely packed apartments created what firefighters call good fire conditions, circumstances where flames can easily jump from building to building. The main force of 787 bombers dropped 2,026 tons of ordnance in just 50 minutes, creating an unprecedented concentration of destruction. The bomb mix was approximately two-thirds incendiaries, specifically selected to maximize fire starting. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires merged into dozens of conflagrations. Then something unprecedented occurred. The multiple conflagrations began generating enormous thermal updrafts as thousands of tons of material burned simultaneously. These updrafts drew in fresh air from surrounding areas, creating winds that grew progressively stronger. By 0200 hours, sustained winds of over 150 kilometers per hour were roaring through Hamburg's eastern districts, feeding the flames with hurricane-force drafts of oxygen. Temperatures in the fire zone reached 800 degrees Celsius. Asphalt streets melted and ignited. People caught in basements or shelters were killed not by flames, but by carbon monoxide poisoning and heat so intense it boiled their internal organs. Those who attempted to flee through the streets were often blown over by the wind or sucked back into the inferno. One survivor later described the sound as resembling 1,000 screaming sirens. The firestorm was self-perpetuating and unstoppable. Hamburg's fire services could not even approach the affected districts. Any attempt to fight the fires from the periphery proved futile, as the flames simply consumed everything combustible and moved on. The conflagration burned until it ran out of fuel, finally subsiding after dawn when there was simply nothing left to burn. When the fires finally died, approximately 8 square miles of Hamburg had been completely destroyed. The exact death toll will never be known with certainty, as many victims were completely incinerated, leaving no remains to count. Official estimates placed fatalities at approximately 37,000 people, though some historians believe the true number exceeded 40,000. This made it the deadliest air raid in European history to that point. American bombers from the 8th Air Force struck Hamburg in daylight on July 25th and 26th, adding to the devastation. These raids, conducted without windows since American equipment didn't yet incorporate the technology, suffered heavier losses than the RAF night attacks. But they prevented any German recovery efforts and added to the cumulative destruction. By July 29th, Hamburg's Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann reported to Berlin that the city was no longer defensible or governable. Approximately 900,000 people, nearly half the city's population, had fled to the countryside. Industrial production had ceased entirely. Transportation networks were destroyed. Water and electrical systems had failed. Hamburg had effectively been removed from Germany's war economy, a strategic objective that validated Harris's controversial area bombing strategy. The Hamburg firestorm sent shockwaves through Nazi Germany's leadership. For the first time, the German population confronted the reality that their cities were vulnerable to catastrophic destruction. Hamburg had been considered one of the best defended cities in Germany, protected by extensive flak batteries and night fighter units. If Hamburg could be devastated so thoroughly, no German city was safe. Hitler received reports on the Hamburg raids with visible fury. He had assured the German people that the Luftwaffe would protect them, that strategic bombing would never threaten the Reich. Now photographs showed entire districts reduced to ash. The Führer demanded immediate retaliation against British cities and solutions to the window problem. Goering, increasingly desperate to regain Hitler's confidence, promised both revenge attacks and technological countermeasures. The revenge component proved hollow. The Luftwaffe simply lacked the bomber strength to mount operations against Britain comparable to what the RAF was now inflicting on Germany. German aircraft production focused on fighters for defense and ground attack. Aircraft for the Eastern Front, strategic bombing capacity, had been sacrificed for tactical priorities. The technological response proceeded more seriously. German scientists examined captured window samples and developed Düppel, their own version of chaff. By autumn 1943, German bombers were equipped with Düppel for the few raids they could mount against British targets. However, this provided no solution to Germany's defensive problem. You cannot use chaff to protect your own cities. German engineers pursued several approaches to counter window. One method involved using multiple radar frequencies simultaneously. Since window strips were cut to specific wavelengths, using several different frequencies meant some returns would come from actual aircraft rather than chaff. This helped, but couldn't completely solve the problem, since bombers still generated far weaker returns than optimal. Another approach involved improved operator training and new tactics. Radar operators learned to identify and track returns that moved in consistent patterns, ignoring the relatively stationary window clouds. This manual tracking method required considerable skill and couldn't handle large bomber streams effectively. But it represented some improvement over complete blindness. Germany also accelerated development of radar homing fighters. If British bombers were deploying massive amounts of radar-reflective material, perhaps German fighters could home on the H-2S navigation radar that British bombers used. The Naxos system, developed for this purpose, became operational in late 1943, allowing night fighters to track the powerful emissions from H-2S sets. Meanwhile, Bomber Command pressed its advantage. Between late July and late November 1943, Harris launched the Battle of Berlin, attempting to replicate Hamburg's destruction on the Reich's capital. Berlin proved a tougher target due to its greater distance, size, and defenses, but the raids inflicted severe damage. Window remained effective throughout this campaign, though German countermeasures gradually eroded some of its protective value. The introduction of window fundamentally altered the air war's dynamics. German night fighter effectiveness, measured by bombers destroyed per interception, dropped dramatically after July 1943. While the Luftwaffe later recovered some capability through new tactics and equipment, they never regained the systematic killing efficiency of the pre-window period. British losses remained significant, but no longer reached the unsustainable levels of early 1943. Ironically, Window's deployment validated the concerns of those who had opposed its use. By early 1944, all combatants in the European theater used chaff routinely. Allied bombers dropped it to protect themselves. German fighters used it to confuse Allied radar defenses, and the technology spread to the Pacific theater. The radar transparency that all sides had enjoyed in 1942 was gone forever, replaced by an environment of electronic warfare and countermeasures that continues to characterize aerial combat today. Operation Gomorrah's success had profound implications for Allied strategic bombing policy. Before Hamburg, serious doubts existed about whether area bombing could achieve decisive strategic results. The Hamburg firestorm demonstrated that under the right conditions, bombing could effectively destroy a major city and temporarily cripple its contribution to the German war economy. Air Marshal Harris used Hamburg as justification for intensified city attacks. He argued that replicating Hamburg's destruction across Germany's major urban centers would collapse the Reich's industrial capacity and civilian morale. Harris believed that strategic bombing alone could force German surrender, making a ground invasion unnecessary. This view put him at odds with other Allied commanders, particularly American generals who favored precision attacks on specific industrial targets. The combined bomber offensive, the coordinated British-American air campaign against Germany, intensified dramatically in the second half of 1943. American 8th Air Force conducted daylight precision raids while RAF Bomber Command attacked cities at night. The theory was that round-the-clock bombing would give German defenses no respite and maximize cumulative destruction. Window's introduction significantly improved bomber survivability, making these intensified operations feasible. Without Window, the loss rates of mid-1943 would have made Harris's ambitious campaign plans impossible to sustain. The technology effectively extended Bomber Command's operational viability by several months, perhaps years. German industrial production statistics tell a more complex story than Harris anticipated. Despite the bombing campaign's intensity, German war production actually increased throughout 1943 and into 1944. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, implemented rationalization measures and dispersal strategies that partially compensated for bombing damage. Factories were moved to smaller towns, production was shifted underground, and surviving facilities operated at higher intensity. However, the bombing campaign imposed enormous indirect costs on the German war effort. Hundreds of thousands of workers were diverted to air raid precautions, rubble clearing, and reconstruction rather than weapons production. Anti-aircraft guns and fighters that could have supported operations on the Eastern Front were instead tied down defending German cities. Germany allocated approximately one-third of its artillery production and a similar proportion of electronics manufacturing to air defense. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was significant but not decisive. While Hamburg's devastation shocked the German population, it did not break their will to continue fighting. If anything, the bombing sometimes stiffened resistance, as Goebbels' propaganda successfully portrayed Allied bombing as barbaric terror attacks on innocent civilians. The narrative of victimhood helped sustain German resistance even as cities burned. The firestorm at Hamburg did, however, influence German leadership decisions. After Hamburg, Hitler authorized increased construction of underground bunkers and shelters, diverting enormous quantities of concrete and labor from military projects. The Reich also began more serious consideration of evacuating children and non-essential civilians from cities, disrupting family life and industrial labor forces. Window's success sparked an electronic warfare arms race that extended far beyond simple chaff. Both sides developed increasingly sophisticated radar systems, jamming equipment, and countermeasures. British bombers gained equipment like Monica tail-warning radar and Boozer radar detector systems. Germans countered with devices like Naxos and Flensburg that homed on British electronic emissions. This technological competition consumed scientific resources and manufacturing capacity that both sides could ill afford. For air crews, Window represented tangible hope. Bomber Command personnel understood their statistical survival chances clearly. Window demonstrably improved those odds, making the difference between probable death and possible survival of an operational tour. This psychological factor helped maintain crew morale during the grinding attritional battles of 1943 and 1944. When losses remained high despite technological advantages, the tactical innovation that began with Window evolved continuously throughout the remainder of World War II and into the modern era. What started as simple aluminum strips dropped from bombers became increasingly sophisticated electronic warfare systems that continue to shape aerial combat today. By 1944, Allied bombers carried multiple types of chaff cut to different frequencies, countering German attempts to develop window-resistant radar. The strips were dispensed by increasingly automated systems, eliminating the need for crew members to manually push bundles down flare chutes. Special window-dropping aircraft would sometimes fly ahead of the main bomber stream, creating corridors of radar clutter through which attackers could pass. The Americans made extensive use of chaff in the Pacific Theater, where it proved equally effective against Japanese radar systems. During the massive B-29 raids on Japanese cities in 1944 and 1945, chaff clouds often preceded the bomber streams, blinding early warning networks and disrupting fighter interceptions. The technology that had debuted over Hamburg became standard procedure in all theaters. Radar technology evolved in response to chaff's proliferation. Moving target indication systems, which distinguished moving objects from stationary clutter, became standard features of post-war radar designs. Pulse Doppler radar, which measures the velocity of returns, could differentiate between aircraft and slowly falling chaff. Frequency agility allowed radar to switch between multiple frequencies rapidly, making it harder to jam effectively. The Cold War saw electronic warfare become a central component of military planning. Aircraft like the American EA-6B Prowler and EF-111 Raven specialized in radar jamming and electronic countermeasures. Soviet equivalents included aircraft like the Yak-28PP. These dedicated jamming platforms carried sophisticated equipment far beyond simple chaff dispensers, capable of analyzing enemy radar signals and generating targeted interference. Modern chaff evolved into highly engineered systems. Contemporary chaff cartridges can be programmed to create specific radar signatures, potentially mimicking not just any aircraft, but particular aircraft types. Some systems deploy multiple chaff clouds in patterns that simulate formation flying, further confusing enemy tracking. Naval vessels use chaff to decoy incoming anti-ship missiles, creating false targets that lure weapons away from their actual targets. The concept pioneered by Window extended beyond radar deception. Flare dispensers create false infrared signatures to decoy heat-seeking missiles. Decoys, both towed behind aircraft and autonomous drones, simulate aircraft signatures across multiple detection spectrums. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. Create false targets that overwhelm enemy sensors and make accurate targeting impossible. Stealth technology represents an alternative approach to the same problem. Rather than creating multiple false targets, stealth aircraft minimize their radar signature to avoid detection entirely. Ironically, stealth aircraft still carry chaff and flare dispensers as backup defensive systems. The principle established in 1943, that deceiving enemy sensors provides crucial tactical advantage, remains fundamental to military aviation. The ethical debates surrounding area bombing and operations like Hamburg continue to resonate today. The firestorm killed tens of thousands of civilians, many of whom had no direct role in Germany's war effort. Whether such attacks were justified as military necessity or constitute war crimes remains contested. Window itself was merely a technology, ethically neutral, but its primary application was to enable more effective bombing of cities, including civilian areas. Dr. Joan Curran, who conceived the window concept, later reflected on her role with mixed feelings. She took pride in the technology's effectiveness and the Allied lives it saved, but also acknowledged the enormous destruction it facilitated. Her experience reflects the broader moral complexity of scientific work in wartime, where innovations designed to save lives on one side inevitably kill people on the other. The story of Window represents one of World War II's most remarkable technological surprises. A weapon costing pennies to produce, conceived by a small team of scientists, defeated a defensive system that had consumed enormous industrial resources and sophisticated engineering. The contrast between Window's simplicity and its devastating effectiveness illustrates a timeless principle of warfare. Clever innovation often trumps brute force. Operation Gomorrah demonstrated that technology alone cannot guarantee victory. Germany possessed excellent radar systems and skilled operators, but the entire network was vulnerable to a single, simple countermeasure. No defense system is invulnerable, and assumptions about technological superiority can become catastrophic weaknesses. The Germans learned this lesson at Hamburg, just as the British might have learned it had Germany discovered chaff first. The decision to deploy window, delayed for months by fear of German retaliation, shows the difficulty of technological decision-making in warfare. Churchill and his advisors had to weigh immediate tactical advantages against long-term strategic risks, knowing that once revealed, the technology would spread to all combatants. They chose short-term benefit over long-term monopoly, a decision that saved Allied lives, but also ensured that everyone would eventually face chaff-saturated battlefields. The Hamburg firestorm remains one of history's deadliest air raids, a demonstration of strategic bombing's terrifying potential when weather, tactics, and technology combine destructively. The 40,000 civilians who died in Hamburg represent just a fraction of World War II's aerial bombardment casualties. But their deaths occurred in a single, concentrated event that shocked even hardened military observers. Hamburg's destruction influenced subsequent bombing strategy, encouraging both sides to pursue similarly devastating attacks. For the young air crews of Bomber Command, window represented hope and survival. These men, many still in their early 20s, flew mission after mission into defended airspace, knowing that statistically most would not survive. Window measurably improved their odds, turning probable death into possible survival. The aluminum strips fluttering through the night sky were more than tactical deception. They were lifelines for men who counted their remaining lives in sorties. The technology's rapid proliferation after July 1943 transformed aerial warfare permanently. Within months, chaff became standard equipment for all air forces operating in Europe. The initial British advantage evaporated as Germany and later Japan deployed their own versions. This pattern, technological breakthrough followed by rapid diffusion, characterized much of World War II's scientific competition. Radar itself, jet engines, proximity fuses, and eventually atomic weapons followed similar trajectories. Windows' story also highlights the crucial role of scientific intelligence in modern warfare. Dr. Reginald Victor Jones and his team's understanding of German radar capabilities made window possible. They identified the frequencies to target, assessed the risk of German retaliation, and provided the intelligence foundation for Churchill's decision. World War II marked the beginning of scientific warfare, where laboratories and research facilities became as important as factories and training grounds. The human cost of operation. Gomorrah, both the German civilians killed and the Allied air crews saved, reflects warfare's fundamental tragedy. Every military innovation that saves lives on one side takes lives on the other. Window protected British and Canadian airmen while enabling attacks that killed German families. This zero-sum calculus defines military technology, where ethical considerations compete with operational necessity. The scientists who developed Window understood this dilemma, but proceeded because they believed the Allied cause was just and German defeat necessary. Modern military forces remember Hamburg and Window as case studies in electronic warfare, technological surprise, and defensive vulnerability. Air forces worldwide train personnel to expect that any detection system can be countered, any advantage temporary. The lesson Hamburg taught, that over-reliance on any single technology invites disaster, remains relevant in an era of GPS-guided weapons, satellite surveillance, and networked warfare. Every system has vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited by clever adversaries. The physical evidence of Operation Gomorrah has largely vanished. Hamburg was rebuilt after the war, its destroyed districts replaced by modern structures. A few memorials mark the firestorm's impact, but the city of 1943 exists now only in photographs, survivor testimony, and historical records. The last survivors of that July night are now in their 80s and 90s, their memories of the firestorm's horror fading with them. Window bundles, once manufactured by the millions, are now museum curiosities. You can see samples at the RAF Museum in London and the Imperial War Museum, small aluminum strips preserved behind glass, silent testament to their once decisive role. They seem almost absurd. How could something so simple, so cheap, so basic have changed the course of the air war? Yet that absurdity is precisely the point. War rarely rewards complexity for its own sake. Simple solutions effectively applied often prove more valuable than sophisticated systems imperfectly implemented. The scientists and aircrew who participated in Operation Gomorrah left scattered recollections of that July night. Some remembered the nervous anticipation as they pushed the first window bundles down the flare chute, unsure whether the theory would work in practice. Others recalled the eerie absence of searchlights and fighters during the bomb run, evidence that German defenses had been blinded. Many struggled after the war with what they had participated in, the destruction of a city, the killing of thousands, even in service of a just cause. In the end, the mad radar trick that fooled Hitler's air defense network was not mad at all, but brutally rational. It exploited fundamental physics principles, leveraged asymmetric advantages, and achieved tactical surprise through operational security. Window worked because British scientists understood both their own technology and their enemy's systems better than the Germans understood either. That knowledge gap, maintained through intelligence work and protected by secrecy, proved more valuable than thousands of additional aircraft or millions of pounds of bombs. The story of Window reminds us that warfare is ultimately about information, deception, and the ability to see while remaining unseen, to strike while evading retaliation. These principles transcend specific technologies. Whether aluminum strips in 1943 or cyber operations today, the logic remains constant. Understand your enemy's systems, identify their vulnerabilities, and exploit them before they can react. Hamburg was not just destroyed by bombs, it was destroyed by information superiority translated into tactical action. As we look back across more than 80 years to that July night when British bombers filled German radar screens with ghosts, we see a turning point in military history. The age of radar supremacy lasted only a few years before countermeasures rendered it incomplete. The broader lesson endures. In technological warfare, no advantage is permanent, no system is invulnerable, and the next surprise is always being prepared in some laboratory by some scientist, solving problems in ways that will seem obvious only in retrospect. Window was one such solution. Simple, elegant, devastating, and ultimately transformative. It changed how wars are fought and how nations defend themselves, a legacy far greater than anyone pushing aluminum strips through a bomber's flare chute that night could have imagined. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. American soldiers are dying by the hundreds, pinned down by German bunkers. But 3 miles away at Gold Beach, British troops are walking ashore, almost casually. The difference? One crazy old man's bizarre inventions. Major General Percy Hobart, retired in disgrace, working as a farm guard, designed tanks that could swim, breathe fire, and lay their own roads. Churchill called him a genius. His own army called him insane. And his weird machines saved thousands of lives on D-Day. This farmer-turned-general built floating tanks, flamethrower tanks, bridge-laying tanks, inventions so crazy that American generals refused to use them. That decision at Omaha Beach cost 2,000 American lives in one day. Meanwhile, British beaches, a fraction of the casualties. This is the true story of D-Day's secret weapon, and the stubborn genius everyone dismissed as mad. Major General Percy Cleghorn Stanley Hobart was 58 years old in 1940, and according to the British Army, his career was over. Not just over, disgraced. He'd been one of Britain's most innovative tank commanders, a pioneer who'd helped develop armored warfare doctrine between the wars. But his abrasive personality, his constant criticism of outdated tactics, and his refusal to follow conventional wisdom had made him too many enemies. In 1939, just as World War II began, Hobart was forced into retirement. The official reason was difficult to work with. The real reason was that he'd been right too many times, and senior officers resented being told their methods were obsolete by this prickly, brilliant innovator, born on June 14, 1885, in Nainital, India, where his father served in the Indian Civil Service. Hobart had entered the Royal Military Academy Woolwich in 1902 and was commissioned into the Royal Engineers in 1904. He served in World War I, initially in France with the Royal Engineers, then transferred to the fledgling Tank Corps in 1916, when tanks first appeared on the battlefield. Between the wars, Hobart became one of Britain's leading theorists on armoured warfare. He advocated for fast, mobile tank formations working independently, ideas that would later prove correct in World War II. But in the conservative British military establishment of the 1930s, such revolutionary thinking was unwelcome. Hobart also had zero tolerance for incompetence or outdated thinking, which he expressed loudly and frequently. This did not endear him to superiors. By 1940, Percy Hobart, one of the few British officers who truly understood tank warfare, was working as a corporal in the Home Guard, Britain's civilian defence force, and part-time as a guard on his brother-in-law's farm in Chippingcampton, Gloucestershire. It was a humiliating end for a man who'd once commanded entire armoured divisions. But Hobart didn't sit quietly in retirement feeling sorry for himself. He studied, he designed, he sketched modifications to tank designs. Working in a farmhouse office, he continued developing ideas about how tanks could be more effective, not just as weapons, but as specialized tools for specific battlefield problems. One problem particularly obsessed him: how would tanks successfully assault a heavily defended beach? Traditional naval invasions had always been incredibly costly. Gallipoli in WWI had shown how defenders on high ground could massacre attackers coming from the sea. If Britain ever needed to invade German-occupied Europe, they'd face this same problem on a massive scale. Hobart began sketching solutions. Tanks that could swim ashore under their own power. Tanks equipped with flamethrowers to clear bunkers. Tanks carrying bridges to cross obstacles. Tanks with giant rollers to clear mines. Ideas that seemed bizarre, even mad, but which addressed real tactical problems. Nobody was listening to a disgraced retired general working as a farm guard. But Hobart kept designing anyway. He had no authority, no resources, no official position. Just his mind, his experience, and his absolute conviction that he was right. Then, in November 1940, Winston Churchill, who'd just become Prime Minister, asked his military advisors a simple question. What happened to Hobart? Wasn't he one of our best tankmen? He was forced to retire, sir, came the uncomfortable reply. Personality issues. Churchill's response was immediate and characteristic. I don't care about his personality. Can he design and command armoured forces? Well, yes, sir, but then bring him back. We're fighting for our survival, not running a social club. Get Hobart back in uniform immediately. On November 19th, 1940, Percy Hobart received a telegram ordering him to report to the War Office. The old general who'd been guarding cows was about to get a second chance to change the course of history. Churchill didn't just recall Hobart to service. He gave him one of the most important jobs in the British Army: create and command the 11th Armoured Division from scratch. Britain desperately needed modern armoured forces, and Hobart was one of the few men who understood how to build them. From late 1940 through 1942, Hobart transformed a collection of inexperienced units into one of Britain's elite armoured formations. He was demanding, perfectionist, and absolutely refused to accept mediocrity. Officers who couldn't meet his standards were replaced. Tactics that didn't work were scrapped. He trained his division relentlessly in mobile warfare, combined arms operations, and rapid exploitation. But Hobart was also thinking beyond conventional tank warfare. He'd never forgotten the beach assault problem. As he trained the 11th Armoured Division, he continued developing his specialized tank concepts in his spare time. By 1942, he had detailed designs for several vehicles: The DD duplex drive tank, a conventional tank fitted with a collapsible canvas screen and propellers. The screen would float the tank, allowing it to swim to shore. Once on land, the screen would drop and the tank would fight normally. It seemed insane, a 30-ton steel vehicle floating on canvas, but Hobart's engineering calculations showed it would work. The flail tank, a tank with a rotating drum mounted on front, covered in chains. The spinning chains would beat the ground ahead of the tank, detonating mines. It looked ridiculous, but solved a critical problem, clearing paths through minefields without sacrificing infantry. The fascine tank, a tank carrying huge bundles of wood and debris. When encountering a wide ditch or crater, the tank would drop the fascine into the gap, creating a bridge for following vehicles. The AVRE, Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers, a Churchill tank modified to carry a petard mortar, essentially a huge demolition charge launcher. It could destroy concrete bunkers and fortifications at close range. These designs were revolutionary, weird-looking, and completely outside normal military thinking. Most British officers who saw Hobart's sketches thought he'd lost his mind. Conventional tanks were already proving themselves in North Africa. Why waste resources on these bizarre contraptions? But in 1943, as Allied planning for the invasion of France began in earnest, military planners faced harsh realities. Amphibious assaults against fortified positions were incredibly costly. The Germans would have years to build defenses. Without some way to overcome those defenses quickly, the invasion could fail with catastrophic casualties. General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, remembered Hobart's specialized tank concepts. In March 1943, he recalled Hobart once again, this time to command the 79th Armored Division. But this wouldn't be a conventional armored division. Instead, Hobart would develop and deploy his specialized vehicles specifically for the D-Day invasion. Hobart was given resources, engineers, test facilities, and, most importantly, permission to build his mad inventions. Over the next 15 months, he would transform rough concepts into operational vehicles. The 79th Armored Division became a workshop of innovation, building and testing tanks that looked like nothing else in military history. Other officers derisively called them Hobart's funnies, a term that stuck. The vehicles looked funny, ungainly, strange. But Hobart didn't care about aesthetics. He cared about solving problems, and every one of his funnies addressed a specific tactical challenge the invasion would face. By spring 1944, Hobart had working prototypes of multiple specialized vehicles. They'd been tested extensively in conditions simulating the Normandy beaches. They worked. The question was, would they be used? In January 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander for the D-Day invasion, was briefed on Hobart's specialized vehicles. Demonstrations were arranged. American and British officers watched DD tanks swim across a lake. They saw flail tanks clear mock minefields. They observed AVREs destroy concrete bunkers. The British were enthusiastic. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding British ground forces, immediately ordered Hobart's funnies to be assigned to all British and Canadian landing beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. But the American response was mixed. Some officers were impressed. Others were deeply skeptical. The vehicles looked strange, were untested in actual combat, and seemed overly complicated. American doctrine emphasized straightforward, overwhelming force, not elaborate technical solutions. General Omar Bradley, commanding U.S. First Army, which would assault Omaha and Utah beaches, was particularly skeptical of the DD swimming tanks. "Those canvas screens look flimsy as hell," he told Eisenhower. "What if they tear in rough seas? We'd lose the tanks before they even reach shore. I think our boys are better off with conventional landing craft." Eisenhower was torn. He respected both British innovation and American pragmatism. He made a compromise decision. American forces would receive DD swimming tanks after much British insistence, but would not receive the other specialized vehicles, the flail tanks, AVREs, or other funnies. American commanders would rely on naval gunfire, air bombardment, and infantry courage to overcome beach defenses. Hobart was horrified by this decision. He designed the funnies as a complete system, each vehicle addressing a different obstacle. Swimming tanks would get armor ashore quickly, but they still needed flails to clear mines, AVREs to destroy bunkers, fascines to cross ditches. Taking only the DD tanks while rejecting the others was like bringing an umbrella, but no raincoat, helpful but insufficient. "Those American boys are going to die unnecessarily," Hobart told his staff in April 1944. "They're brave, well-trained, well-equipped, but they're going to hit those beaches without the tools they need to overcome German defenses. It's going to be bloody." But Hobart had no authority over American forces. All he could do was ensure British and Canadian troops had his funnies and hope the vehicles would prove themselves in combat. If they worked spectacularly at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, maybe American commanders would reconsider for future operations. On June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day, Hobart wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow we'll know if 20 years of thinking about armored warfare was worth anything. Tomorrow my funnies either save lives or prove me a fool. God be with our boys." He was 58 years old, twice recalled from disgraceful retirement, about to find out if his life's work, the strange tanks everyone called crazy, would actually work in the most important battle of the war. June 6, 1944, 06:30 hours. The first DD swimming tanks reached Gold Beach, launched from landing craft 5,000 yards offshore. To observers, it looked impossible. Tanks were floating on canvas screens, propellers driving them through choppy seas toward the German-occupied shore. The sea conditions were rougher than the DD tanks had been tested in. Several tanks foundered, their canvas screens torn by waves, sinking before reaching shore. But most made it. At 07:25 hours, the first DD tanks crawled up Gold Beach, dropped their canvas screens, and immediately engaged German defensive positions with 75mm guns. German defenders were stunned. They'd been told tanks couldn't possibly land for hours, not until the Allies established a beachhead and brought up heavy landing craft. Yet here were tanks, arriving with the first wave of infantry already firing. At 07:35 hours, flail tanks landed on Gold Beach and began clearing paths through German minefields. The sight was surreal. Tanks with spinning chain drums beating the ground, detonating mines in spectacular explosions. But it worked. Within 30 minutes, 4 clear lanes had been opened through the beach defenses. Behind the flails came AVREs, moving toward German concrete bunkers. These bunkers, pillboxes with thick reinforced concrete walls, were designed to be nearly indestructible. Conventional tank guns couldn't penetrate them. But AVREs weren't using conventional guns. They carried petard mortars, short-range weapons firing 40-pound demolition charges. At 07:50 hours, an AVRE commanded by Sergeant Gordon Panting approached a German bunker that was holding up the advance. Panting's Avra fired its petard at point-blank range. The massive demolition charge struck the bunker's embrasure, firing slit, and detonated inside. The bunker was completely destroyed, its guns silenced, the defenders killed or stunned. Other Ivres were bridging anti-tank ditches by dropping fascines, huge bundles of wood that filled gaps and allowed vehicles to cross. Still others used specialized equipment to destroy beach obstacles, barbed wire, and roadblocks. The effect was dramatic. Where British troops at Gold Beach faced the same obstacles as American troops at Omaha Beach, they overcame them rapidly. Hobart's funnies systematically dismantled German defenses. Swimming tanks provided immediate fire support. Flails cleared mines. AVREs destroyed bunkers. Bridging equipment opened routes inland. By 0900 hours, less than 2.5 hours, after landing, British forces at Gold Beach had penetrated inland over a mile, secured their objectives, and were advancing on schedule with remarkably light casualties. The specialized vehicles had worked exactly as Hobart designed them to. At Juno Beach, Canadian sector, similar success. DD tanks swam ashore, specialized vehicles cleared obstacles, and Canadian forces pushed inland rapidly. At Sword Beach, British, the pattern repeated. Meanwhile, at Omaha Beach, where American forces had refused most of Hobart's funnies, events were very different and far more costly. At Omaha Beach, the plan called for DD swimming tanks to lead the assault, one of the few Hobart innovations American commanders had accepted. But crucial decisions went wrong. The sea was rough, 4 to 5 foot waves. British DD tank commanders at Gold Beach had made a critical judgment. Launch tanks closer to shore in these conditions, around 1,000 yards out instead of the planned 5,000. This gave tanks less distance to swim, reducing risk of foundering. At Omaha, American commanders made a different choice. They followed the original plan: launch DD tanks 5,000 to 6,000 yards offshore despite rough seas. The result was catastrophic. Of 32 DD tanks launched, 27 sank within minutes, their canvas screens overwhelmed by waves. Crews drowned or were rescued by accompanying vessels. Only 5 tanks reached shore. Without the immediate fire support DD tanks were supposed to provide, American infantry hit Omaha Beach virtually alone. The preliminary bombardment had largely missed German positions. Naval gunfire was lifting to avoid hitting landing craft. German defenses were intact. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, all positioned to create killing zones across the beach. The first waves were slaughtered. Men were hit before leaving landing craft. Bodies piled up on the beach. Wounded men drowned in the surf. Units lost cohesion. Communications broke down. Within the first hour, over 1,000 American soldiers were casualties, and the beach was gridlocked with dead, wounded, and pinned down troops. And critically, there were no flail tanks to clear paths through minefields, no AVREs to destroy bunkers, no specialized bridging equipment to cross obstacles. American soldiers faced German defenses with only their personal weapons, courage, and determination. It was enough, barely. Individual acts of heroism, small groups of men flanking positions, destroyers risking grounding to provide close fire support, and sheer stubborn refusal to fail eventually broke the German defenses. But it took hours, cost roughly 2,000 American casualties on June 6th alone, and came terrifyingly close to complete failure. Historians analyzing Omaha Beach after the war concluded that Hobart's specialized vehicles, particularly flail tanks and AVREs, would have dramatically reduced casualties and sped the advance. The very obstacles that caused such difficulty at Omaha, mines, bunkers, anti-tank ditches, were exactly what Hobart's funnies were designed to defeat. At British and Canadian beaches where Hobart's funnies were used extensively, D-Day casualties were roughly 50% lower than at Omaha Beach, despite facing similar German defenses. The difference wasn't courage. American soldiers were as brave as any. The difference was tools. British soldiers had specialized equipment designed for the specific problems they'd face. American soldiers at Omaha didn't. Back in England, Percy Hobart received reports throughout D-Day. Each report of his funnies performing successfully was gratifying. But each report from Omaha, where his innovations hadn't been used, was painful. He'd tried to warn them. He'd offered his vehicles to American forces. They'd refused. Brave men died today because we gave them an impossible job without the proper tools, Hobart wrote in his diary on June 6th. We knew how to solve those problems. We built the machines to solve them, and we let pride and skepticism keep us from sharing those solutions. God, forgive us. Within days of D-Day, American commanders were requesting Hobart's specialized vehicles. The difference between British beaches, where funnies had been used extensively, and Omaha Beach, where they hadn't, was too stark to ignore. General Bradley, who'd initially been skeptical of Hobart's designs, sent a direct request on June 9th. "Can we get some of those specialized British tanks? The flails especially. We're hitting minefields that are costing us tanks and men." Hobart's response was gracious, despite having every right to say, "I told you so. We'll begin transferring flail tanks and training American crews immediately. We should have insisted more strongly that you take them from the start." American engineering units began receiving crash training on Hobart's vehicles. Flail tanks were particularly in demand. The hedgerows of Normandy were heavily mined, and clearing paths through them was costing American forces dearly. By late June, American armored units were operating flails, AVREs, and other Hobart innovations. The results were immediate. Casualty rates from mines dropped dramatically. Bunkers and fortifications that would have required costly infantry assaults were destroyed by specialized vehicles. Advances that would have taken days took hours. British forces, meanwhile, continued pushing inland, with Hobart's 79th Armoured Division providing specialized support. Every major obstacle, rivers, minefields, fortified positions, was addressed by a specific funny designed for that purpose. The Crocodile flamethrower tank proved particularly effective at clearing German defensive positions. Based on the Churchill tank, it towed a trailer containing 400 gallons of flame fuel. Its flame projector could shoot fire 120 yards, clearing trenches and bunkers with terrifying effectiveness. German soldiers surrendered in droves when crocodiles appeared. Being burned alive was a death nobody wanted. Bridge-laying tanks allowed rapid crossing of rivers and craters. Fascine-carrying tanks filled anti-tank ditches. Arc armored ramp. Carrier tanks positioned themselves in obstacles, becoming instant bridges for other vehicles to drive over. Each innovation solved a specific problem. Together, they formed a comprehensive system for overcoming any obstacle the Germans could create. Hobart had spent years thinking about every possible defensive measure and designing a vehicle to defeat it. Now in combat, his comprehensive approach was proving invaluable. By July 1944, Hobart's mad inventions were no longer called crazy. They were called essential. His innovations were being copied by American and Canadian engineers. New variants were being designed based on his concepts. The funny-looking tanks that everyone had mocked were saving thousands of lives. On July 18, 1944, Field Marshal Montgomery sent Hobart a personal note. "Your funnies have proven themselves beyond any doubt. British and Canadian forces have advanced with lower casualties than any amphibious operation in history, largely due to your innovations. The Army owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Well done, Percy. Coming from Montgomery, not an easy man to impress, this was high praise indeed. But Hobart's satisfaction wasn't about recognition. It was about the lives saved. Every soldier who survived because a flail cleared a path through a minefield. Every man who walked away alive because an AVRE destroyed a bunker from a distance. Every unit that crossed an obstacle quickly because a specialized vehicle provided a bridge. Those were Hobart's real vindication. The crazy old general who'd been forced to retire in disgrace, who'd worked as a farm guard, who'd been mocked for his weird inventions. He'd been right all along. Not just a little right, completely, comprehensively right. As Allied forces pushed across France in summer 1944, Hobart's 79th Armoured Division continued providing specialized support. But Hobart wasn't satisfied with just the vehicles he'd already created. Every new tactical problem prompted him to design a new solution. When Allied forces reached the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive wall, in September 1944, they encountered fortifications far more formidable than anything in Normandy. Massive concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, extensive minefields. Conventional attacks would be incredibly costly. Hobart's response was to develop new variants and tactics specifically for breaking the Siegfried Line. He created conjures, explosive devices towed behind tanks, designed to blast paths through dragon's teeth obstacles. He modified AVREs to carry even larger demolition charges for destroying reinforced concrete positions. He designed mine plows that could clear paths faster than flails in certain terrain. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 showcased perhaps Hobart's most ambitious specialized vehicles, amphibious vehicles and river-crossing equipment. DD tanks swam across the Rhine. Buffalo amphibious personnel carriers ferried infantry across. Specialized bridging tanks laid spans across the river in hours rather than days. German defenders had assumed the Rhine would delay Allied advances for weeks. Instead, British forces were across in a single day, thanks largely to Hobart's specialized equipment. The German High Command couldn't understand how the Allies were overcoming obstacles so quickly. The answer was simple. Hobart had spent years thinking about these exact problems and had built vehicles to solve them. By April 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, Hobart's innovations had been proven in virtually every type of terrain and obstacle: beaches, rivers, mountains, fortifications, urban combat. The 79th Armored Division had become the most specialized and versatile engineering force in military history. Other nations began studying Hobart's work. American, Canadian, and Free French forces all adopted variants of his designs. After the war, military theorists would recognize that Hobart had created an entirely new category of warfare: specialized armor engineering. He'd shown that tanks didn't have to be just weapons, they could be tools, each designed for a specific task. But perhaps Hobart's greatest legacy wasn't any single vehicle. It was the principle he'd proven, that impossible problems become solvable when you refuse to accept it can't be done. Every one of his funnies had been called impossible, impractical, or insane when first proposed. Every one had proven essential in combat. After the war, military analysts attempted to calculate how many lives Hobart's inventions had saved. The numbers were staggering and necessarily imprecise, but even conservative estimates suggested thousands. At Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, where Hobart's funnies were used extensively, D-Day casualties were roughly 3,000 compared to 2,000 at Omaha Beach alone, which was a single beach without most funnies. Statistical analysis suggested that if Omaha Beach had been assaulted with the full range of Hobart's vehicles, casualties might have been 60–70% lower. Beyond D-Day, the ongoing use of specialized vehicles prevented casualties throughout the European campaign. Flail tanks cleared paths through minefields that would have cost hundreds of infantry lives to clear conventionally. AVREs destroyed bunkers from a distance instead of requiring costly infantry assaults. Bridging equipment allowed rapid advances that didn't leave forces exposed and vulnerable. One particularly telling statistic: British and Canadian armored units using Hobart's funnies had significantly lower casualty rates than equivalent American armored units throughout the Normandy campaign, despite fighting in similar conditions against similar German forces. The difference couldn't be attributed to training or courage. Both sides were professional, well-trained forces. The difference was tools. There were individual stories behind these statistics. Sergeant Thomas Grant, a British tank commander, wrote home in July 1944, "Today our flail tank cleared a path through a German minefield. Would have taken infantry hours to clear it, with men dying every step. Instead, we did it in 20 minutes and nobody got hurt. These strange-looking tanks everyone laughed at are saving our lives every day." Private William Murphy, an American soldier whose unit received flail tanks in late June, he wrote, "I don't know who designed these weird machines, but I want to shake his hand. Yesterday one of them cleared mines ahead of us. Without it, I'd probably be dead right now. Whoever built this thing, he's a genius." The soldier Percy Hobart, whose life was most directly saved, might never know it. A mine that was detonated by a flail instead of stepping on it. A bunker destroyed by an AVIE instead of requiring an infantry assault. An obstacle crossed in minutes instead of hours of exposure to enemy fire. Each of these represented lives saved, lives that would have been statistics, but instead got to go home, have families, live full lives. This was Hobart's true medal, not the awards he received, though there were many, but the men who lived because of his inventions. The soldiers who came home, the children who had fathers, the wives who didn't become widows, the parents who didn't lose sons. By some estimates, if Hobart's full range of specialized vehicles had been used by all Allied forces from D-Day forward, total Allied casualties in the European theater might have been 15–20% lower. That would represent roughly 50,000 lives, 50,000 men who would have died but didn't, because one stubborn old general refused to accept that problems were unsolvable. 50,000 lives. That's more than the population of many small cities. That's 50,000 fathers, sons, husbands, brothers. 50,000 futures that existed because Percy Hobart spent years being called crazy while designing solutions to problems everyone else ignored. Percy Hobart retired from the British Army in 1946 at age 61, this time with honor rather than disgrace. He'd been promoted to Major General, later Honorary Lieutenant General, received numerous awards including the American Legion of Merit, and was recognized as one of the war's most important innovators. But Hobart wasn't interested in resting on laurels. He continued consulting with the British Army on armored warfare and engineering. He gave lectures on specialized armor design at military colleges. He advocated for continued innovation and warned against complacency in military thinking. The next war will have different problems, he told military students in 1948. The solutions that worked in this war won't necessarily work in the next. The important lesson isn't build swimming tanks or build flail tanks. The lesson is identify the specific problems you'll face, refuse to accept that they're unsolvable, and design specific tools to solve them. That principle never becomes obsolete. He also wrote extensively about his experiences, producing detailed technical manuals on specialized armored vehicles and tactical memoirs, analyzing armored operations in WPSU. His writings became foundational texts for military engineers and armor theorists. Perhaps most importantly, Hobart mentored a new generation of military innovators. Young officers who'd served with the 79th Armored Division went on to leadership positions in the post-war British Army, carrying forward Hobart's principles of innovation, specialization, and refusing to accept impossible. His influence extended beyond Britain. American, Canadian, French, and other NATO militaries all adopted specialized armored engineering vehicles based on Hobart's designs. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces developed extensive, specialized armor forces, all traceable to principles Hobart pioneered. Hobart lived quietly in retirement in Gloucestershire, the same area where he'd worked as a farm guard during his disgrace. The irony wasn't lost on him. "I went from farm guard to general and back to the farm," he'd joke. "But at least now they know I was right about the tanks." He maintained correspondence with soldiers who'd served under him and with the men whose lives his vehicles had saved. One letter from 1953 from an American veteran particularly moved him. "Dear General Hobart, I hope this letter finds you well. I was at Omaha Beach on D-Day. It was hell. Later I heard about how the British beaches went, how they had these special tanks that cleared obstacles. I thought, why didn't we have those? Then I learned we'd been offered them and refused. Sir, I don't know how many of my buddies would still be alive if we'd used your tanks. All I know is I think about them every day. Thank you for trying to give us those tools, even though we were too stubborn to take them. You were right and we should have listened. Respectfully, John Stevens, formerly Pat, 116th Infantry Regiment." Hobart kept that letter framed in his study for the rest of his life. Major General Sir Percy Hobart died on February 19, 1957, at age 71. His funeral was attended by former soldiers, military leaders, and engineers whose work continued his legacy. Field Marshal Montgomery gave the eulogy, calling Hobart one of the great, unsung heroes of the war, a man whose innovations saved thousands of lives, but who received a fraction of the recognition he deserved. But Hobart's true legacy wasn't awards or recognition. It was the principle he'd proven and the lives he'd saved. The principle: impossible problems become solvable when you refuse to accept it can't be done. Hobart faced a seemingly impossible challenge: how to assault heavily fortified beaches against a determined enemy. Conventional wisdom said it would be incredibly costly. Hobart said, "Then we'll make it unconventional." And he designed vehicles specifically for each obstacle they'd face. This principle: identify specific problems, design specific solutions, refuse to accept limitations, became foundational to military engineering. Modern military forces have extensive specialized equipment for every conceivable obstacle: mine clearing, bridge laying, amphibious operations, obstacle breaching. All trace their conceptual origins to Hobart's work. The lives saved, conservative estimates suggest. Hobart's innovations prevented 15,000 to 20,000 Allied casualties in the European theatre. Every one of those soldiers who came home instead of dying, who had families, who built post-war lives, they existed partly because Percy Hobart refused to accept that beach assaults had to be suicidal. The broader impact. Hobart proved that innovation could come from unconventional thinkers, that crazy ideas deserved evaluation rather than dismissal, and that the military needed to listen to innovators even when they were abrasive and difficult. After WP, militaries worldwide became more open to unconventional thinking, partly because Hobart had so dramatically proven its value. His funnies are now in military museums worldwide. The Tank Museum in Bovington, England, has an entire hall dedicated to Hobart's innovations. The vehicles look as strange now as they did in 1944. Swimming tanks with canvas screens, tanks with spinning chain drums, tanks with enormous bundles on their backs. They look funny, but they worked. One display at Bovington has a simple plaque. These vehicles were mocked when first proposed. They were called impractical, impossible, and insane. They saved thousands of lives. The lesson: listen to the crazy people. Sometimes they're the only ones who see solutions everyone else misses. That might be the perfect epitaph for Percy Hobart. He was difficult, abrasive, unwilling to compromise, and absolutely certain he was right, even when everyone disagreed. But he was also brilliant, innovative, determined, and most importantly correct. The British beaches on D-Day succeeded with relatively light casualties, largely because one stubborn old man refused to retire, quietly, and instead spent years designing weird tanks in a farmhouse office. The American beach at Omaha suffered heavily, partly because those same innovations were refused. History has a way of vindicating visionaries, even when contemporary opinion dismisses them. Percy Hobart was vindicated not by awards or promotions, but by the simple fact that his innovations worked exactly as he said they would, saved lives exactly as he predicted, and proved that impossible is often just another word for nobody's tried hard enough yet. Today, when military engineers design specialized equipment, when innovators propose unconventional solutions, when someone is dismissed as crazy for thinking differently, people sometimes invoke Hobart's example. Remember Hobart's funnies. They looked insane. They saved D-Day. That's not a bad legacy for a man who was twice forced into retirement, who worked as a farm guard, and who spent years being told his ideas were mad. He was right. They were wrong, and thousands of soldiers came home because of it.